The shooting range was a dull gray rectangle of concrete and rusted metal, worn down by years of use. Sunlight poured through the cracks in the chain-link fence, catching on the bits of dust that hung in the air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. The sounds of boots on gravel and the metallic clatter of weapons being readied mingled with the occasional crack of a rifle, each shot sharp and loud, echoing against the flat desert hills beyond. Serena stood off to the side, far from the huddled, noisy group of recruits at the far end of the range. The atmosphere was thick with mockery, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter, brash enough to make the surrounding emptiness feel alive with their arrogance. They were young, cocky, the kind who shouted their own names like a badge of honor, flexing their muscles as if the size of their biceps could somehow mask their lack of real skill. She didn't belong here. Or at least, that's what they thought. Her feet were planted solidly on the sun-baked earth, but she didn't move. Her posture was something like stillness itself, the kind of poise that seemed effortless but wasn't. A life lived long enough to perfect such a subtle, imperceptible thing. Her faded black combat shirt, slightly oversized, hung loosely around her frame, the fabric catching the breeze as she stood like a statue, watching. Her hands rested at her sides, fingers twitching just enough to betray a tension that no one else seemed to notice. The recruits, on the other hand, couldn't help but notice. They had to. She was too quiet. Too calm. Too out of place. "Hey, you!" A loud voice called out, interrupting the otherwise constant barrage of gunfire. One of the recruits, a private with an exaggerated swagger, his helmet cocked at an angle like he was trying to look important, pointed directly at Serena, his voice laced with mockery. "You gonna stand there all day like some, wet blanket?" His buddies snickered behind him, their faces flushed with the flush of arrogance, but none of them dared to approach her. They wouldn't. Instead, the private jerked his thumb over his shoulder in exaggerated frustration, pulling his rifle into a crude imitation of a practiced stance. "Maybe she should be out here with us. Can't be harder than whatever it is she does." Laughter followed, sharp and cruel, like the sound of a razor cutting through air. The group of recruits scattered to various points on the range, taking their positions as if to prove something. Their weapons slammed into their hands, movements overdone, desperate. It was as if they were trying to be something they weren't, trying to force respect from the air around them. Serena didn't react. She didn't even blink. The private sneered, his fingers drumming impatiently on the rifle's stock. "She's probably just here to play nursemaid, right? Bet she's got all kinds of meds to make us feel better when we screw up." The snickers grew louder. A few recruits mimicked her posture, trying and failing to look calm and unbothered. The contrast was painfully obvious. Loud, flexing bodies against one still figure, grounded and centered, like a rock that wouldn't move. And yet there was something about her, something far too quiet, far too calculating, that made them uncomfortable. One of the recruits, the loudest, dropped his rifle with a metallic thud, throwing a glance toward Serena as he adjusted his body armor. "You know, if you really want to impress us, how about you show us what you've got?" he teased, stepping forward, daring her to move. Serena's eyes never left them, her gaze unfaltering. For a second, the sound of a nearby gunshot filled the air, echoing off the walls, breaking the silence. The recruits all turned their heads for a moment, their attention shifting, but then, just as quickly, they were back to her. "Bet she's afraid of the gunfire," the private muttered, nudging his friend with a grin. "Or maybe she's just scared of real work. You know, some of us actually earned our spot here." Another round of laughter rang out. The stillness of Serena's presence remained. Her lips barely parted, the ghost of a smile playing at the corner of her mouth, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile born of experience, of knowing things that no one around her could yet comprehend. A soft, almost imperceptible twitch of her hand beneath the sleeve of her shirt, a movement so small it could have been nothing, caught the sunlight just enough to reveal the hint of a faded tattoo. It peeked out from beneath her sleeve, A symbol, a faded relic from a past life, one that would remain untouched by the brashness of the recruit's mockery. And then, as one of the recruits fired off a round with a loud grunt, Serena's eyes flickered to the target. Her gaze was sharp, calculating. Her body remained still, silent, but the way she studied the shot said everything. The way her posture remained perfect, unbroken. The recruit missed by a wide margin. He cursed under his breath. "Not bad for a medic," he spat, trying to hide his embarrassment. But Serena didn't answer. She just stood there, watching. For a moment, the range seemed to grow quieter, the laughter fizzling out as the recruits shifted uncomfortably. Something was off. They didn't know what, but they could feel it. Serena wasn't just out of place. She was different. And they were starting to realize they didn't understand why. She didn't flinch. She didn't engage. But her presence, like the air in the room itself, was slowly becoming something that demanded attention, whether they wanted to give it or not. The tactical drill was set up like an obstacle course for the mind, a labyrinth of barriers, checkpoints, and a series of simulated threats that demanded the perfect balance of skill and timing. A real war could be won or lost on decisions made in this kind of chaos. In theory, the recruits were ready, but their overconfidence was palpable, each one practically bursting with the belief that they were invincible. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, harsh shadows over the battlefield, the training grounds at the edge of the base, a mixture of dirt, rocks, and the occasional scattered remnants of old training gear. The wind kicked up, carrying the scent of desert dust and the sharp tang of sweat. The sound of boots marching in unison filled the air, the low hum of radios crackling in the background. The recruits were standing in a loose line, each one fiddling with their gear, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, helmets slightly askew, their bodies stiff with pride. They stood apart from the obstacle course, acting like it was just another walk in the park. But the smugness in their posture and the arrogance in their grins were starting to rub against something far more dangerous than the obstacles ahead. Behind them, Serena stood at the edge of the field, her figure barely noticeable in the shifting haze of sunlight and dust. She didn't belong here, not by any standard. Her uniform, once black and fitted, now looked too big for her slender frame, hanging loosely as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She stood still, her gaze never wavering as she watched the recruits, but the intensity in her eyes was sharp enough to cut through the desert heat. She wasn't in their world, not with the overconfident bunch of young soldiers who swaggered around her like peacocks, laughing at things they didn't understand. She wasn't supposed to be here, but her quiet presence was enough to make them uneasy. "Well, look who decided to show up," one of the louder recruits muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. His name was Ferris, and he was the worst of the bunch, cocky, loud, and absolutely convinced of his superiority. His rifle hung casually at his side, his stance wide and proud, like he was already a legend in the making. Ferris shot a glance at Serena, then elbowed his buddy, a broad grin spreading across his face. "I bet she's just here to babysit us, huh? You know, make sure none of us get hurt while we show her how it's done." The others chuckled, a few even hooting in agreement. Serena didn't respond. She didn't even blink. She simply stood there, her arms relaxed at her sides, her gaze fixed on the course ahead. "You're not even gonna say anything, nurse?" Another recruit called out, a tall, muscular guy named Hudson. His voice had a sarcastic edge, as if he had already ridden her off. "Come on, you don't even belong out here." The teasing didn't seem to faze Serena. Her silence spoke volumes. She was an island in a sea of mockery. The recruits, who couldn't go 2 minutes without making noise, seemed to grow quieter, unsure of how to deal with someone who wouldn't engage. Ferris, sensing the opportunity to rattle her, marched over and slapped her lightly on the back, hard enough to make her sway slightly. "You gonna keep standing there like that all day, or are you gonna show us what you can really do?" His voice was playful, but the challenge was clear. Serena's eyes flicked briefly to Ferris's face, her gaze flat and unreadable. The moment stretched longer than it should have, the tension hanging in the air like an invisible thread, pulling tighter and tighter. Serena didn't move. Didn't flinch. "Maybe later," she finally said, her voice low and calm, the words measured and deliberate, as though she was speaking to herself, not to the recruit in front of her. But the recruit didn't get the message. He chuckled, too self-assured to realize that there was something deeper beneath the surface. The other recruits started to shift uneasily, their eyes darting between Serena and Ferris, but no one spoke up. The drill began. Serena hung back, watching with a quiet intensity as the recruits moved through the course, their movements overzealous, clumsy. They shouted commands to one another, shouted insults, shouted to reassure themselves of their own strength. But every time they made a mistake, every time they tripped or hesitated, Serena's eyes stayed on them, impassive, like a silent judge. One by one, they approached the first major obstacle, a barricade with limited cover, designed to test their ability to make split-second decisions under fire. Ferris led the charge, diving toward the cover with exaggerated precision, his rifle raised high as if to announce his victory. He fired a few rounds at the target, each shot echoing loud enough to shatter the desert's silence. "Perfect!" Ferris shouted, spinning around to face the group. "This is how you do it, you hear me?" He didn't notice the malfunction until it was too late. His rifle jammed mid-sentence. The click of the malfunction was unmistakable. Metal against metal, a stutter in the symphony of gunfire. Ferris cursed under his breath, frantic, trying to fix the issue with one hand while keeping his rifle aimed. It wasn't working. "Come on!" "What the hell?" Ferris barked, struggling to clear the jam. The recruits all watched in silence, a few shifting their weight uncomfortably. But no one stepped forward to help. Serena did. Without a word, she stepped forward, her movements slow but sure, cutting through the space between herself and Ferris like a shadow. She didn't hurry. She didn't need to. She knelt beside Ferris, taking the rifle from his hands with a fluid motion. Her fingers moved quickly, precisely, her hands working the mechanism with the kind of confidence that only came from years of training that no one here had seen. Within moments, the rifle was functioning again. Serena handed it back to Ferris, who stood frozen, his face a mix of confusion and reluctant respect. For a moment, no one spoke. There was only the sound of the wind stirring the sand, the thrum of nervous energy in the air. Serena didn't wait for thanks. She simply turned and walked toward the next obstacle, her silhouette cutting through the harsh desert light like someone who had nothing to prove. The training ground was quiet now, the hum of the morning heat almost unbearable as it wrapped around the barren landscape like an unyielding cloak. The sun blazed high above, casting harsh shadows across the cracked, parched earth. The obstacle course sat untouched in the distance, still littered with the remnants of yesterday's drills, discarded helmets, tangled ropes, a few forgotten water bottles that glinted in the dry air. Today, the recruits stood in formation, their faces still flushed with exhaustion, their bodies stiff from the day's relentless workout. There was a strange, almost imperceptible tension in the air. Something had changed, but none of them knew exactly what. Ferris, still in the lead, his rifle slung across his chest, glanced toward Serena, who was standing to the side, leaning against the wall of the training shed. She was, as always, still and calm, her posture perfect, her eyes hidden behind the dark shadows of her cap. If they thought they understood her before, they were mistaken. The humiliation had already begun to settle in, creeping under their skin like a quiet ache. The failure on the obstacle course, their inability to perform under pressure, had not gone unnoticed. The loud bravado that had once been so effortless now felt hollow. Every smirk, every insult thrown Serena's way, had started to taste sour in their mouths. They weren't mocking her anymore. They were avoiding her. In the far corner of the base, the officer, Commander Reeves, stood watching. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on Serena, a quiet recognition in them. He'd known her type before, the silent, deadly kind that never needed to brag. The kind that people underestimated until it was too late. And it was now too late for these recruits. The moment had come. "All right, listen up!" Reeves's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "The next drill is a test of skill, speed, and precision. We'll be running a simulated hostage rescue. The clock's ticking. You'll need to be quick, calm, and, above all, strategic." The recruits stood at attention, their gazes flicking toward each other. This was the kind of challenge they'd been waiting for. But none of them looked at Serena. None of them dared. "Ferris, Hudson, take point. The rest of you, follow through with your respective teams. And remember, no heroics. I want clean, tactical movements." The words were meant to direct, but the undertone was clear. No one was going to do this alone. Not even the best. The recruits moved into position, trying to maintain the cocky posture they had worn just days ago, but it was thinner now, fragile. They started to move through the simulated battlefield, navigating obstacles, their bodies tense, their movements rushed. They barked commands at each other, fumbling with their gear, like kids playing at war. They didn't see the danger, not yet. Serena stood alone at the edge of the field, her figure barely a silhouette against the rising heat of the midday sun. She hadn't moved an inch since Reeves had given the command. She was still, too still. For a brief moment, the recruits hesitated, the slightest tremor of doubt flickering behind their eyes. But then they moved, charging forward like soldiers in a game, with all the confidence of those who had yet to be tested. The mockery had vanished, replaced now by the frantic pace of competition. They were going to finish this, make it look easy, and forget all about Serena's quiet defiance. But it wasn't going to happen that way. Serena's eyes narrowed, just slightly, as she watched them stumble forward, struggling to keep pace with the demands of the exercise. Ferris led the charge with the others trailing behind, their focus splintering, their panic starting to show in the tightness of their movements. It wasn't long before the first mistake was made, a miscalculation at the first obstacle, a moment of hesitation that spread like a virus, knocking down confidence and increasing the tension with every second. "Hudson, move!" Ferris barked. "Get to the front!" Hudson hesitated, but only for a moment. He wasn't ready. His movements were too slow, too uncertain. He tried to scale a barrier, but his grip slipped. He swore, fumbling for his footing, the seconds slipping by with every wasted motion. The recruits started to fray, their irritation leaking out in the form of shouted insults, but nothing could break their growing frustration. They couldn't keep up. They couldn't maintain the pace. Their loud voices were hollow, and their earlier bravado began to fall away, piece by piece. Serena pushed off the wall, her body moving with a quiet grace. She didn't need to announce her presence. She didn't need to declare her intentions. She was already ahead of them. Her movements were surgical, each step deliberate, precise. Where the recruits stumbled and faltered, she glided over obstacles. Where they hesitated, she acted, cutting through the course with the ease of someone who had lived it. Her hands moved like they were born for this, no wasted motion, no hesitation. By the time the recruits reached the final checkpoint, Serena was already there, standing by the hostage scenario with a look of quiet authority. Her arms were folded, her gaze impassive as Ferris and his team rushed in, panting, struggling to keep up with the clock. Ferris froze as he saw her standing there, the unmistakable sense of dread creeping in. "You finished?" he asked, disbelief threading through his voice. Serena nodded, her eyes locking with his. There was no need for words. The damage had already been done. The recruits, who had thought they could race through this exercise like it was a competition, now saw the truth. They weren't the fastest. They weren't the smartest. And most importantly, they weren't the best. Behind them, the officer approached, his footsteps slow and deliberate, the sound of his boots pressing into the sand carrying a weight of finality. "Well done, Sergeant," Reeves said, his tone low but steady, with just the slightest note of reverence. "You've earned their respect." The recruits stood silent, their shoulders slumped, their heads down. There were no more jokes, no more mockery. Only the slow realization that they had just been schooled by someone they had never even bothered to understand. The whispers began to spread. Quietly, reverently. "That's Reaper 6, someone said. "She trained Ghost Squad 0, another voice added. The words were like a ripple in the water, spreading slowly at first, but then picking up speed. They could feel it now. The weight of the legacy Serena had carried all these years, a legacy built in silence, carried out with precision. They had underestimated her. But now, they would never forget her. And in the distance, the plaque would be waiting.